Most people don't fear death. They fear reaching it and realizing they never actually lived. And the worst part? You already feel it, that quiet emptiness behind a life that looks completely fine from the outside. This is about that. You already know which one is yours. Before I even go further, somewhere deep in your chest, there is already a quiet knowing, a memory that rises too easily, a version of your life you almost lived but didn't. That is not coincidence. That is the weight of something you have never fully made peace with. Palliative care nurses have sat beside thousands of people in their final weeks. They held hands in dimly lit rooms. They listened to voices that had grown soft with exhaustion and time. And what they heard was never about money, never about missed promotions or unfinished projects. What they heard were quiet confessions, about dreams filed away like old letters, never reopened, about people who were never told the truth, about lives that looked completely right from the outside but felt hollow from within. These weren't dramatic revelations. They were whispered, almost embarrassed, like someone finally admitting something they had spent an entire lifetime pretending not to feel. And the part that should stay with you is this. These regrets did not begin at the end. They began on ordinary afternoons, in small decisions, in silences that eventually became permanent. Most people don't consciously choose the life they end up living. They absorb it. From parents who meant well but projected their own unlived dreams onto young, impressionable shoulders. From teachers who measured human worth in grades and output. From a culture that handed them a complete script before they were old enough to ask whether they even wanted the role. You wanted to create, but you studied something practical. You wanted to explore, but you accepted the stable position. You wanted to say something completely honest, but you smiled instead and said you were fine. And each time you chose the expected thing, the safe thing, a quiet part of you walked into a room inside yourself and simply waited. It is still waiting. Psychologists call this the false self, the version of a person that learned to perform acceptability rather than live authentically. And this is not weakness. It is survival. When love and belonging feel conditional on performance, the human mind becomes whoever it needs to become in order to keep them. The tragedy is not in having made sacrifices. Sacrifice can be meaningful and necessary. The tragedy is that so many people spend their entire lives without ever pausing to ask whose voice was actually making the decisions. Was it theirs, or was it the accumulated echo of every dismissive look, every be realistic, every people like us don't do things like that? What returns in those final weeks is never the memory of some grand failure. What returns is the specific, vivid moment when someone didn't apply for that thing, didn't move to that city, didn't allow themselves to want what they actually wanted. The wish in the end was never for a different outcome. It was simply for the courage to have tried at all. There is a second thing people carry into their final days, and it cuts quietly, in a more personal place. People grieve the relationships they allowed to erode not through cruelty or dramatic conflict, but through slow, unconscious absence. Work became the priority because work always felt urgent. The friend who needed a call received a brief apologetic message instead. A parent grew older while the visit kept getting rescheduled into a future that never quite arrived. A partner stopped sharing their interior world because they had learned, gradually and painfully, that sharing no longer led to genuine presence. Here is what almost no one is willing to say about busyness. It is one of the most sophisticated forms of emotional avoidance ever constructed by the human mind. When we stay constantly in motion, we don't have to feel the discomfort of a relationship that needs a real and honest conversation. We don't have to sit in the uncertainty of love that asks something genuinely difficult from us. We just stay occupied, useful, perpetually behind on something that feels important. And the people who love us understand. That is the cruelest part of all. The ones we quietly neglect make excuses for us. They tell themselves we are busy. They wait until one day, without any announcement, the distance becomes the relationship itself. Until the person who once called you first now calls someone else. Until a parent dies holding words they never found the right moment to say, and now that moment will never exist. Attachment research is clear about this. Human beings are not designed for emotional isolation. We are fundamentally wired for connection, for presence, for being genuinely known by another person over time. And when we habitually choose achievement over intimacy, something inside us slowly and imperceptibly dims. You will not notice the exact moment it begins, but one day you will feel it, standing in a crowded room, successful by every external measure, and completely, profoundly alone inside it. There is a third thing, and people bury this one the deepest because admitting it requires a kind of honesty that most of us have never been taught to practice. It is the weight of unexpressed truth, words that stayed inside, emotions that were swallowed because the moment felt wrong, or the relationship felt too fragile to risk, or the fear of conflict was simply louder than the need to finally be honest. Consider how early this begins. A child learns very quickly which emotions are acceptable in the environment they grow up in. Joy gets met with warmth. Anger gets punished or shamed into silence. Sadness gets dismissed with impatience. Anxiety gets minimized with a wave of the hand. And so, slowly and without any formal instruction, the child develops an internal editor so fast and so sophisticated that it begins censoring feelings before they even fully form. By adulthood, many people have almost completely lost access to their own emotional truth, not because they don't feel, but because the feeling arrives and is immediately translated into something safer, something smaller, something that will not create discomfort for anyone in the room. People reach the end of their lives holding entire conversations that never happened. The apology never offered, the gratitude never spoken to the person who changed everything, the boundary never set with someone who kept crossing it, the love never made into a daily spoken habit. And what they realize, finally, in those last quiet weeks, is that the thing they were protecting by staying silent did not survive anyway. The relationship shifted, the person left, the connection faded regardless, but the unspoken truth remained, lodged somewhere deep, like a stone the chest eventually learned to carry as though it had always been there. Emotional suppression does not dissolve feelings. Neuroscience confirms this without ambiguity. Unfelt emotions migrate into the body, into anxiety that arrives without obvious cause, into anger directed at things that don't deserve it, into a persistent, low-level heaviness that becomes so familiar it eventually starts to feel like personality. Your feelings were never too much. They were simply offered to people who had too little capacity to receive them. That is not the same thing at all. There is a fourth thing people carry, and in many ways it is the quietest grief. It is not rooted in failure or conflict or dramatic loss. It is rooted in the deliberate, ongoing postponement of joy. The unconscious belief absorbed so early it feels like simple fact that happiness must first be earned before it can be allowed. That rest must be justified by sufficient sacrifice. That pleasure is only acceptable once enough difficulty has been demonstrated to the world. In homes where love was conditional on achievement, children learn that their worth requires constant proof. You perform, you receive warmth, you achieve, you belong. And so you push and sacrifice and exhaust yourself with the quiet internal promise that eventually you will deserve good things, but eventually never arrives. Because the goalpost always moves. Because a mind trained in conditional worth cannot simply switch to unconditional enjoyment. Because when genuine joy does appear, something inside immediately whispers that it will not last, that you are not ready for it yet, that you should not settle into it too deeply. And so entire lifetimes get spent waiting. Waiting until the debt feels paid, until the house is finished, until the children are settled, until things feel calmer and more certain and more deserved. People stand at the edge of the ocean thinking about tomorrow's unfinished tasks. They sit at tables surrounded by people they love and are somewhere else entirely. They lie in beautiful places feeling almost nothing because the internal permission to actually feel it has never been granted. What people mourn at the very end is not that joy was absent from their lives. It is that joy was fully present, completely available, and they were so committed to preparing for life that they forgot to inhabit it. Joy is not something you earn through sufficient suffering. It is something you choose to allow. And that window does not remain open indefinitely. The fifth thing is perhaps the most personal, the one that requires the most courage to look at without looking away. It is about the relationship each person carries with themselves, about the relentless, unearned harshness of the inner voice, about how many years were spent at war with the very person they were trying to live as every single day. This inner critic does not arrive from nowhere. It is carefully constructed from early experiences of shame, the public correction that burned long after it ended, the comparison to a sibling that landed like a quiet verdict, the parent who was rarely satisfied and never said so with any gentleness, the culture that defined human worth through appearance and productivity and constant visible output. And over time, this voice becomes so automatic, so immediate, so fluent that people stop recognizing it as a voice at all. It simply feels like truth. You are too sensitive, too much, not disciplined enough, behind everyone else, broken in some way that other people simply are not. And they believed it for decades completely. And in believing it, they held themselves back from opportunities they deserved, from love they were worthy of, from rest they desperately needed. They made themselves smaller to preemptively avoid rejection. They abandoned dreams before anyone else could say no. They stayed in situations that quietly diminished them because they were not certain they deserved anything better. At the very end, people do not wish they had been harder on themselves. They wish, with the clarity that only arrives when time has grown genuinely short, that they had been gentler, more patient with their own inevitable imperfection, more forgiving of the universal difficulty of being a human being alive in a complicated and often painful world. That is not an excuse for anything. It is simply the truth, and it is a grace you are allowed to offer yourself right now without waiting for some final chapter to arrive. These 5 things share something essential. They all begin in silence, in the small, ordinary moments where fear was chosen over honesty, where performance replaced genuine presence, where someone else's comfort was quietly placed above one's own becoming. They accumulate invisibly across years until their full weight becomes impossible to ignore. But the people who carried the least regret into their final days were not the ones who had lived perfectly. They were not the ones who made all the right choices or avoided every wrong turn. They were the ones who had, at some point, decided to stop building their entire life around other people's expectations, who had allowed themselves to feel what they actually felt, who said the true thing even when their voice was unsteady, who let themselves be loved without earning it first. They were imperfect, often afraid, frequently uncertain about everything, but they were genuinely present in their own lives in a way that made the living of those lives feel real and worth something. Healing does not look like never having regret. It looks like catching yourself mid-performance, mid-erasure, mid-avoidance, and choosing differently, not perfectly, not all at once. Just today you could say the thing you have been holding inside. Today you could rest without building a justification for it. Today, you could call the person whose voice you have been quietly missing. Today, you could let yourself want what you actually want, even if it makes no sense to anyone watching from the outside. The life you are afraid of wasting is still here, still unfolding, still quietly offering you moments you have not yet recognized as irreplaceable. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are someone who's been surviving inside structures that rarely stop to ask what you actually needed. What do you want your life to feel like? Not look like. Feel like. Start there. And be patient with yourself on the way,